Coming up on this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society, I see dead consoles. It's dangerous to go alone, so the Nintendo Cartridge Society goes with ya. Welcome to Nintendo Cartridge Society. My name is Patrick Ellers, and I'm joined, as I'm always joined, by my co-host, Mark Mitchell. Mark, how's it going?
Patrick, it's going great. We may have talked about this before, but do you remember what your first CD was? Do you remember buying your first CD?
Yes, my first CD was Real Big Fish's Not Why Do They Rock So Hard, Turn the Radio Off, was the first CD I ever bought.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Do you remember, did you go to like a record store for it? Like a Blockbuster Music, a Sam Goody?
Yeah, Goody got it. I don't remember. It's possible that I went to what was it called? Something and CD Exchange. Shoot, I can't remember the name of this record store in my hometown, but it was like a family-owned record store. I had a friend who worked there a little bit later, so she wasn't working there at the time, but I think that's where I bought my first record.
I think my first CD that I bought myself for
You're right,
myself.
CD. I'm sorry. It's a CD. It's a CD. We're not talking about records. I buy very little vinyl. Didn't buy any when I was younger.
No, there was like another family-run store called World Records that was
That's good.
maybe like
World Records?
I know it is
name.
good.
That's a good
Yeah,
name.
especially I think it was like a mile away from our house, and I was
straight up.
I was old enough that I was able to walk,
Yeah.
but not old enough that I could
Drive.
So I think I was like 11, maybe something like that.
What was the first CD you bought?
It was like Disney Classics Volume 1 or something like that.
Mark, don't ever change.
You know, one of those like compilations. I in a lot of ways, Patrick, I haven't. Yeah. But then I remember being like 14.
Yeah.
13 or 14, and I was about to go on like a trip with my peers, and I remember the first like cool CD
Yeah.
I think that I bought for myself was Weezer's Blue Album. And
That's a cool CD to buy for yourself.
I'm pretty sure I bought it online from like a CD specific store. So like I can't remember what it was called, but it was
wasn't like the Columbia House like
no,
record
no,
thing.
it was like allmusic.com or like, like
Yeah.
all like CD something or another.com.
Not CD Baby. That's something that exists now. Does CD Baby still exist?
I don't know.
Okay.
What is CD Baby?
CD Baby. So CD Baby was a place where you could, if you were releasing your own records, that was a way to distribute them. Anything that I've ever recorded has been available on CD Baby at one time or another.
Got it.
And CD Baby also had good relationships with streaming services. So like you would put your CD on there, and they would get it out to all the different streaming platforms.
That makes sense. Patrick, happy to tell you CD Baby still exists.
Still exists. Thank you.
CDBaby.com.
Thank you, CD Baby. I've gotten maybe $50 from CD Baby over the course of my life. A lifetime of record sales, maybe $50 from CD Baby.
You gotta love the economics of streaming music.
Yes. Well, and that's all from before streaming. That's all people who actually bought the record.
Oh, that's amazing.
From streaming, I think I've seen like 8 cents. Here's a good way to see 8 cents. You won't see 8 cents this way. Get on the Sonic Forces borrowing program list. All you gotta do is email us at nintendocartridgesociety@gmail.com and give us a mailing address so we can send you my copy of Sonic Forces for the Nintendo Switch, mailed to you with postage paid by me. More than 8 cents, I'll tell you that much. You play it for as long as you want. You pack it back up in the envelope I provide for you, and you ship it using the postage I provide for you. It's a perfect borrowing program.
These segues could be a little bit dangerous because there's the potential if we
yeah.
didn't have more self-control that we could go down a road where we're like, do we need to put 8 cents in with every copy of Sonic Forces that we get sent out?
Yeah, well, I mean, we don't even technically have a copy of Sonic Forces going out in every time we send out Sonic Forces.
Right.
Sometimes it's Untitled Goose Game, so don't freak out. You haven't been lied to. You haven't been tricked. It is just something that happens.
Another thing that is not a lie or a trick is that you can leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere that you get your podcast. We appreciate it so much when you do. It helps people find the show. Patrick and I love reading your reviews. I've said it before and I'll say it again. We've had a really nice string of thoughtful, lovely reviews. So thank you so much to anybody who has ever left us a review. If you leave us a review on the US Apple Podcast Store, we can see it and we will give you a shout out on the show. But if you leave us a review anywhere else or you share the show in some other way, we can't see it, but we want to acknowledge it. So let us know. You're not bragging.
No, it's not a brag. It's not, and it's not like a, it's not like you're some saintly figure coming in to deliver us from a reviewless world. No, we want to know these things.
Exactly.
Like, communicate it to us.
Yeah, send us an email, hit us up on Twitter. Let us know so we can give you a shout out on the show.
Also, while you're doing that or while you're doing something else, you should try to get into our Discord. It is a fun place where people are talking about the games that they're playing, the games that they want to play, and basically everything that's going on in Nintendo. But you need an invite to get invited. So email us, hit us up on Twitter, do whatever you can. We will let you in, and you can join us having a great time talking about Nintendo stuff. Mark, we've got a couple emails here that we want to address very quickly. Email from Denko. Denko writes, "Hey guys, Denko from Sweden here. For the longest time, I've been listening to your podcast and other Nintendo podcasts from overseas. I have always been so confused whenever you or other podcast hosts talk about Nintendo Switch Online and the fact that it doesn't work very well, lagging, etc. I have never had any problems whatsoever about Nintendo Switch Online. Everything works just fine. Sure, sometimes you'll team up with someone with a terrible connection, but I've experienced that on Xbox as well. So I'm thinking it's wrong to blame Nintendo for the bad reception. Perhaps you should blame the USA's infrastructure? Love the podcast, never stop. 5-star review." Mark, what do you think?
I think that that's really interesting. I don't know. I don't know enough about Nintendo's like network and where they have like servers and how like all of that works to really have an educated opinion. Not that it's ever stopped me on the show before.
No, have the opinion, Mark.
But yeah, I would buy that. That's definitely part of it for sure.
So the thing is, I do think that's part of it, but I have played PlayStation games online before with way fewer issues. There was a time where I was playing Ghost of Tsushima online a lot with my friends, and we never dropped. I never like lost frames or anything like that. So I think, and those are like complicated visually, but they're also like I'm hardwired in on the PlayStation.
Yeah, so it would not surprise me if it's a number of contributing factors, right? That all kind of add up to shaky experiences for people. Because I think the fact that the Switch, the original Switch especially, has like notoriously cheap Wi-Fi components.
Well, and so this is the heart of the question. Is it notoriously bad because we're just experiencing bad internet, or because the components actually are bad?
No, so I think it's a combination of three things. So I think that the components are not the best, right? And so that's a contributing factor. But all things else being equal, I don't think it'd be a problem. However, I think that Nintendo, if they're, and this is all speculation, but if their investment in online in the back end matches their investment in like the front end, then I think that they're still way behind where other companies are.
Yeah, I think that's
as far as
right.
like infrastructure goes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a contributing factor. And again, maybe if like, I think, and then the third thing is I don't know what their server setup is like, right? So maybe if you're in Europe, there's more servers and so there's less lag. But in the US, the servers are more spread out to try to, cover the entire area. And so
they're on like AWS, right? I mean, just like basically everyone
I would guess so, but I don't know for sure. But yeah, so I would maybe if like if one of these things is wrong, but the other two are fine, your experience is fine. But in certain areas,
when two of them start to get
bad, exactly. Then maybe, but again, I have no idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, Mark and I are totally comfortable blaming U.S. infrastructure for like any problem that we encounter. We'll say that's a contributing factor to a bad Nintendo Online experience. We also got an email from Patty D. Patty D writes, "Hi, Patrick." Sorry, I was gonna say hi, Patrick and Mark, but it's actually addressed to Mark and Patrick. So I was going with like our show standard style, which is always my name first and then your name. But he addresses it hi, Mark and Patrick. I was listening to the latest episode, and Patrick was talking about being on somewhat of a GBA kick at the moment and asked for some ideas about games to play. I'm not sure about your thoughts on these types of games, but a couple of games that you don't already own and aren't ports would be Advance Wars and Fire Emblem. Each had a couple of entries on the system. Advance Wars is great, and since nobody knows when the Switch remakes will be released, this is the only way to play the first two games. Fire Emblem is Fire Emblem, but older and with permadeath, which is weird to think about since since death is conceptually permanent. Anyway, PSA that the 3DS and Wii U eShops lose the ability to add any funds on the 29th. Another great episode, Patty D. So two things there. One, August 29th, last day to add funds to your Nintendo Switch.
A good reminder.
A good reminder, yes. Not Nintendo Switch, the 3DS and Wii U eShops.
Which you would have to do indirectly now because you can't do it with a credit card.
Because you can't do it with credit cards. But I think... Would you still be able to add funds to your Switch eShop account and use the funds that way when they're all linked together? Because that's how I have been doing it since it stopped accepting credit cards.
I think now through the 29th, yes, that is true.
Interesting. 29th is very close.
Yeah, only a few days away.
Only a few days away. So I do have both Advance Wars 2. I said both, but this is two sets of both Fire Emblem and Fire Emblem Sacred Stones on the Wii U, the GBA Virtual Console, and I like those games, but I do think it would be more fun to play them like handheld, genuinely on the go, than on my Wii U gamepad. So Patty D, those are good suggestions. Thank you. Mark, are you ready to get into our topic today?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's dig in to the 6th year of Nintendo console libraries. So I'm not sure we've come up with the best way to clearly articulate what the premise is here, and I don't think I did a good job just before going into the break, into the music here. What we're doing is, look, we're actually nearing the end of the 6th year of the Switch's life cycle right now, and that is sort of we're out far enough that we are at the outer reaches of most console generations, especially in Nintendo's past, where by the 6th year, the next piece of hardware is already out, or the next piece of hardware is like on the imminent horizon, and the games that are coming out on them represent something about the state of that console. So we thought we would go back through the console generations and identify a game or two from the 6th years that paint a picture of what it was like to be playing these things at that time, or just a game that we wanted to talk about. Maybe our favorite game from that. Like it's hard to say. I don't know what Mark's list is. He doesn't know what my list is. We're being very secretive here.
Yeah, but I think that's a good summation. And once we get into it, it'll all start to make sense.
All things will become clear. Have you ever played like a complicated board game and like at the beginning of the instructions, which are like 6 pages long and like a little stapled booklet, it says like, once you begin playing, all things will become clear?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what this is.
Yes.
So, get your 12-sided dice ready and, make sure you've got enough tokens to follow along. We're playing this thing. Mark, let's start with the NES.
Originally released fall 1985. So that we're putting the 6th year between fall 1990 and fall 1991. So games that released in that period.
Right. And the NES is obviously like difficult to pinpoint when exactly it came out because it sort of trickled out in test markets starting in like New York in the fall of 85. But we're just counting generally fall 85. So yes, fall 90 to fall 91. Mark, what have you got? Let's why don't you go first?
Okay, so the game that I picked is a combo cartridge that we've talked about on this show before. It's Super Mario Brothers, Duck Hunt, and World Class Track Meet, which were all released on one cartridge in December of 1990.
Wow. What a good pick.
So the reason I picked this one is this is actually the version of the console that my parents bought for us. So it wasn't until 1990 that I had an NES. And before that, like, I was too young to know what a Nintendo was. And so, we didn't own any video game consoles before that. I was not up on like marketing or anything like that. Like I had no idea Nintendo existed, and then this NES dropped in our lap, and this combo, this cartridge came in a bundle essentially that was sold by Nintendo that included this cartridge with the 3 games, the power pad,
Mm-hmm.
and the light gun zapper.
Yes.
So that way you could play World Class Track Meet and Duck Hunt. And so
And it also came with just a single controller, right?
I don't remember.
I don't remember if it had 1 or 2 controllers.
Yeah, because I actually don't remember growing up. I want to say we had 2 controllers, but I honestly can't remember for sure if we
Yeah.
had 2 NES controllers or not.
Yeah, it's
Because
weird.
not a lot of 2-player games that we didn't own a lot of simultaneous like co-op 2-player games.
Yeah, but I felt like everyone had the 2 controllers, right?
So maybe the bundle did come with 2 at
Maybe
that
it
point.
did. Well, when you think of sorry, just to jump in a second, that like the Famicom in Japan had the 2 controllers that were hardwired in. You couldn't even unplug them. So like maybe that was just part of it. They were like, oh yeah, you got to give them 2.
Yeah, I mean, I genuinely don't know if just a regular Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985 came with 2.
Yeah, I'm
Did
not
it?
sure.
I don't know. The reason that I picked this one and being in December 1990, so not that far away from the Super Nintendo's release at this point,
Right.
is that the NES had reached such saturation and they had had such success that at this point they were like bundling all of these things together
Yes.
to make it like, I mean, it worked on my parents, right? Like it was marketable enough. It had, yeah, it was, there was so much Nintendo stuff out there. The NES was so dominant that they had sold so many of them that now they were kind of like looking for other ways to repackage what they already had.
Yeah, well, and like looking to reach into those non-video game playing markets too, right? Like that's
Right.
what World Class Track Meet is all about, and sort of what the Light Gun and Duck Hunt is about too. Is like, oh, reach out to people who have like messed around with like a a gun shooty game in an arcade or something, which is a different audience than because everyone sort of intuitively understands like you point a thing and pull a trigger, right? Like that makes sense. So yeah, those are both just like easier points of access for non-gamers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which basically everyone was at this time in 1990. Like no one identified as a gamer in 1990. I
Right.
don't think.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a great pick, Mark. I love it. My pick. So I have one that I know counts, and then one that's like just a little bit outside.
Okay.
So the one that counts for sure, Battletoads, came out in June of 1991. I'm never going to miss an opportunity to talk about Battletoads. But the thing that's so interesting about Battletoads to me is that you can tell that it is pushing what the NES is capable of, in that like every level was a different gameplay style. And there were these like giant sprites of like enemy characters that like were way bigger than something you would see in other games. And it was just a punishingly difficult, just like savage game that I loved to death. I love Battletoads. And there's also something so like uniquely 1991 about the way it's just like ripping off the Ninja Turtles in aesthetic and just like trying to get a little piece of that pie, right? So for me, that game is just quintessentially 1991. But then the other game that I have, and this came out in November 91, so it's probably like on the outside of the 6th year, like beginning of the 7th year, is the NES game Robin Hood Prince of Thieves. Have we talked about Prince of Thieves?
No, we haven't.
Oh my God. So this is another game that is like from level to level, a totally different kind of game. It is primarily like an overhead game. It recounts the story of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, the Kevin Costner movie, also from 1991. So it is primarily like overhead, like a Zelda-like kind of RPG, but then it snaps into battles that are almost Street Fighter-esque, like as you're doing a one-on-one fight against like the Jailkeeper or Little John or the Sheriff of Nottingham or whatever. And then there are all these like horse chase sequences, some from the side, some from above. It's just like a crazy game that presents you with like maybe a dozen different gameplay styles, all to like represent the story of this pretty crappy Robin Hood movie. But a Robin Hood movie that was so big and so successful in the 90s.
It was so
Yeah.
successful. So I love those picks. Battletoads.
Yeah.
Can we talk about that for a second? So I didn't become aware of Battletoads until I was probably in my teens, late teens, like, when websites dedicated to bad video games or
Right,
like that
right.
sort of thing started popping up. I'm curious, like, how were you exposed to Battletoads? Was it in Nintendo Power? Because 91 is
Probably.
pretty
It was
late.
It was
Yeah.
probably in Nintendo Power. But I mean, I was so plugged into Ninja Turtle stuff that like, I tried all of like anything that had anthropomorphic like animal warriors in it. I was there. So like, I don't know. I probably just
Street Sharks.
Yeah, absolutely Street Sharks. Those like I forget what the cowboys. They're like cows that are. Do you remember these guys? Like anything. I didn't care. Right. It could be bad, and I was like, yes, that's me. So I feel like I just felt vibrations in the force, and I was like, there's a new one of these
That's
things out
amazing.
there. And so I was drawn to it. And I remember my friends Scott and Reed were the three of us were very much into Battletoads early on, and like trying to unlock because the difficulty spike in the game is on level 3, right, of 12. And that's the infamous like hover bike section where you just have to memorize the track ahead of you, and even once you have it memorized, you have to execute it almost perfectly in order to get through it. And it was one of those things that I set my, 9-year-old attention span to, and I just did it. I just obsessed over it and learned how to do it, which then unlocked it for me, years later when I picked it back up in college. And I was like, I'm going to get good at Battletoads again. And I didn't have to relearn the hoverbike sequence because I still knew it. It was still in my fingers, Mark.
That's amazing.
And yeah, so I mean, I could talk about Battletoads all day. I won't subject you to it. But I do think it is unfairly maligned, largely by. And look, is it fair to say that the third level is too hard and that you give up and don't experience the rest of the game? Like, yeah, absolutely, that's fair. But the rewards on the other side of that level are so great. If they could just take that game and tone down the difficulty in the third level, or give you like a rewind function or whatever, I think the rest of the game would be heralded as the classic that it should be.
That's so interesting. I wonder if some of its reputation was kind of like, lack of a better term, poisoned by the reputation
Yeah.
it had when I became aware of it, where it's like a joke game instead
Yes,
of,
yeah.
because it's so difficult and because it's impossible to beat in co-op.
It is,
because of those,
yes,
like,
that
but
is
you
also
know what
true.
I mean? Like
Level
those-
11 is physically, you cannot progress as two players, yes.
But yeah, another thing just I want to point out in the NES in general before we move on is that we're talking about its 6th year in 1991, but the last game for it wasn't released until December 1994.
And this is Wario's Woods, which I also was set down like a little bit of a wormhole because we've talked about this a couple times, that like I can never remember if Zoda's Revenge or Star Tropics 2 or Wario's Woods are the last game that came out on the system in 1994. It is Wario's Woods. Wario's Woods came out so late that it is the only NES game to have an ESRB rating.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
That is so crazy.
It's printed right there on the box.
That's amazing.
But yeah, like 1994. Not only is Wario's Woods the last first party game on the NES, it's the last NES game to have the Nintendo seal of quality on it.
Wow.
And the first to have a ESRB rating.
Yeah, that's so crazy.
Isn't that nuts? Mark, before we move on to the Game Boy, which is obviously the next, I just wanted to touch on Game & Watch for a second. Because I was like, is there anything interesting in the Game & Watch's 6th year? Game & Watch, first one released in April of 1980. Ball, of course, and a handful of others. But the 6th year feels like kind of a slump to me. So that is Tropical Fish, Blackjack, Squish in 85, and then early 86 is the Super Mario Bros. Climber and Balloon Fight. So like not really any of the games that we were excited about when we had our Game & Watch month. But Mark, because it's my birthday today and because I was born in 1982, I just want to shout out what a banger year the Game & Watch had in 1982. I'm breaking the format and I'm sorry. Here are the games that came out on Game & Watch in 1982. Turtle Bridge, Fire Attack, forget Fire Attack, Snoopy Tennis, Oil Panic, Donkey Kong Jr., Mickey and Donald, and Greenhouse.
It's a good year.
It's a killer year for the
Yeah.
Game & Watch, 1982.
Which makes sense because you said the first ones were released in 80.
Yeah.
So, they had a couple years underneath their belt. Also, seems like they were kind of like churning these things out.
Yeah.
So at that point, you know, they were probably like, they'd figured it out what made a good Game & Watch game. And we're just really in the prime.
It out. Also just 82, like a good, like Blade Runner, Thriller, E.T.
Yeah, okay. We get it.
Me.
We get it.
All right. I'll stop torturing you with my birthday stuff. The original Game Boy.
Released April 1989. So it putting its 6th year between April 1994 and April 1995.
Yes.
Something to point out here is that Pokemon was 4 years away from the start of like that April 1994. So Game Boy was in a weird place.
Game Boy was already in its like late stage like dementia, and then Pokemon comes along and just like revives it, necessitating like a redesign of the system and eventually the Game Boy Color. All of that is driven by Pokemon, and then you could argue that every handheld release from then on is like chasing that Pokemon high. But yeah, Mark, what do you have for your 6th year game here?
So the one I picked is not one that I've actually played, but I feel like it's so, just by the title alone, you're like, yep, that sounds like where the Game Boy would be, kind of in its fallow period before Pokemon was released, but it's been out for so long. The game I picked is Jurassic Park Part 2, The Chaos Continues, released in December 1994.
Wow.
A sequel that was made for the Super Nintendo, but then like a Game Boy version was created that just continues the story of Jurassic Park, because Jurassic Park still such a phenomenon.
Yeah.
At this point, plus when you look at
was it modeled off the Super NES Jurassic Park game?
I don't know if it was. No, so there was a Super NES Jurassic Park game also called Jurassic Park Part 2, The Chaos Continues.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
But is that a sequel to the Super NES Jurassic Park game, or is it just like its own game? Because the Super NES Jurassic Park is like half overhead, sort of like Zelda-like, and half first-person shooter.
Yeah, I do not know. The Game Boy version is like a side scroller. So you go through 4 different zones on different parts of the island, which I'm assuming is just the same island as from the previous game.
That sounds like the Genesis version of the Jurassic Park games, where you could play as Grant or as the Raptor.
Oh, uh-huh.
Yeah.
So the reason, again, like why I like Jurassic Park Part 2, The Chaos Continues, is I think it is such a good snapshot of pop culture in 1994, where kids are still and the world is still obsessed with Jurassic Park and dinosaurs, but also a good illustration of where the Game Boy is at, where it's like, yes, Nintendo has some stuff that came like a little bit outside of the 1 year period we have here, but for the most part, Nintendo is not really making a lot of first-party games for the Game Boy, and
except they make one of the best Game Boy games during this period.
Yeah, but I don't think, which I think we're talking about Donkey Kong 94.
Yeah,
but my memory, anyways, is that when Donkey Kong 94 came out, I don't, whether it reviewed well or not, like I don't think that it has the reputation that it had the reputation then that it has today.
Yes. So I do a double pick here, which is both Donkey Kong 94, which came out in June 94, and Mario's Picross, which came out in March 1995. Both games which were bangers, but would take a couple years to be recognized as the truly revolutionary things that they are. Mario's Picross is a series that I didn't realize I needed in my life until, like, I don't know, we started doing the show, I guess. So 6 years ago. So yeah, for me, like, this period is, yes, about the sort of like pop culture tie-in shovelware, but it is also about Nintendo quietly doing great work. And, that's sort of where the Game Boy is until Pokemon comes out, right? Like, and there's like the great work again, just coming out and selling so many Game Boys that like it goes on to live for another like 5 years after that.
Yeah.
So those are my picks. Mark, are you ready to move on to the Super NES?
Yes.
Super NES originally released September 1991, so our 6th year here is September 96 to September 97. Mark, what do you have for your 6-year game here?
I picked a November 1996 game, which is Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble.
Yeah.
And the reason I picked this one is because by 1996, especially by like November 1996, Rare's A Team, Nintendo's A Teams, they were all turning their attention to the Nintendo 64. And so,
Yep.
Dixie Kong's Double Trouble is really the other team at Rare, like getting their shot to step up and create this game that feels like the stakes were lower than like a Donkey Kong Country 2. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit of anytime there's these cross-generational games where the new system is already out or just about to be out, and so that's what's getting like all of the press. You always have, these late first-party published titles that kind
just
of
occupy
have,
a weird space.
Have kind of like a sour reputation, because it's not.
Well, and Donkey Kong Country 3 has a chip on its shoulder too, right? When you save at Wrinkly Kong's house, whatever you do at Wrinkly's house, she's playing Mario 64 on her Nintendo 64, and you can hear the music of Peach's Castle like playing in sort of a 16-bit style within the game, which like is cool, but it's kind of like the game being like, don't you wish you were playing Nintendo 64?
Right. So yeah, I feel like Donkey Kong Country 3 just paints a really good picture about what like support in these cross-generational moments looks like a lot of time.
But I think this is another one where the game itself, I think, better than its reputation.
I think so too. I remember
it's got a bad reputation.
I think we played it for the first time, or at least I played it for the first time all the way through when it was released on Super Nintendo, like Nintendo Switch Online.
Yep.
And I really liked it, but I think it's partly because like it had such a bad reputation going into it, that it was easy to overlook its flaws.
So before I like actually dug into like the specific dates here, I thought for sure my answer to this question was going to be Super Mario RPG, but it's too early. Super Mario RPG came out in May of 96, so it's a couple months too early to be in the 6th year. But both Kirby Superstar and Kirby's Dream Land 3 fall into this window. So like Kirby as an entity, just like a general entity, is like a harbinger of like the end of a console generation. Although Kirby's also just like omnipresent, so like maybe that's an unfair thing to say. But the game that I actually picked here, and the one I really want to talk about, is Harvest Moon. Came out in June 1997, and Mark, you're right that by the 6th year, Nintendo had mostly moved on from supporting the Super NES. We are also seeing the like total exodus of Square Enix, as they would not work with Nintendo for like kind of a while. So there was like a RPG shaped hole in the system's lineup, and not to say that Harvest Moon is an RPG necessarily, but like, I mean, it's the first farming sim that like I ever played, and is just such a like fun like experience that you can just like sink tons and tons of hours into. Did you ever play the original Harvest Moon?
No, I never played the original. I played Friends of Mineral Town on
GBA?
the Game Boy Advance, which is that a remake of the first game, or not remake, but kind of like a
I have no idea.
glow up of the first game?
The original Harvest Moon is the only one I've ever played.
Oh, okay.
And I loved it. I loved the insane restrictions on it. You had to name all of your cows, but they could only have 4-letter names. So like the first couple cows are moo and milk always. And then you got to get creative. You only have 4 letters to do it. You have a dog, you can get married, you have a horse. All these things are great. And it's a farming sim. Like, what's not to love?
One thing that's interesting about the Super Nintendo is that it didn't have much of a life past the release of the N64. Like, if you look at a list of games that were released, like 1997 was the last time that there were multiple releases. And then, at least on Wikipedia, they list one game in October of 1998.
What is it?
Frogger. That came out in October.
Right. And then, of course, since the Super NES is so like iconic, there have been like other like way later releases. But that's Frogger, that's incredible. But yeah, I mean, I think the Nintendo 64 was so like specific, and by the time that it came out, the PlayStation was already like staking its ground, and like people just wanted 3D graphics. It's kind of why you didn't see a lot of like 2D or pixel based games on those platforms at all, just because like that wasn't in vogue anymore.
Yeah, didn't PlayStation, at least in the United States, kind of have like a rule where
Oh, I don't know.
like against 2D games? I think they did.
I mean, whether they had a rule or not, it was like, why? That's not what's sold,
Right.
you know. Um, so now the next on the list is the Nintendo 64, but let's just pour one out quickly for the Virtual Boy.
I think we should. I added it to my list as well.
Did you?
Yes, because I just felt like we needed to talk about it.
The Virtual Boy, originally released in August of 1995. We could do 6 months after it came out.
It feels like that'd be scraping even then. Yeah,
The sixth month, Nestor's Funky Bowling came out in February 1996. That's the penultimate game that came out on the platform. 3D Tetris would come out in March of 1996. But yeah, so like 7 months of support is what the
because
Virtual
it was
Boy got.
released in August 1995.
Yes.
I do like to imagine what like a June 2020 or June 2001 to June 2002 or like August or whatever would release would look like. Maybe Nestor's Funky Bowling 6 at this point. I assume it'd be a yearly franchise.
So wait, we're talking 2001 to 2002.
Uh-huh.
Geez. Yeah, I don't know, like some sort of like 3D Paper Mario thing or something.
Yeah. I don't know.
It's a grim proposition. Sorry to drag you through that, Virtual Boy, but like we just had to bring you up. Mark 1990, Nintendo 64, originally released June 1996, which means its 6th year is June 2001 to June 2002.
Oh, I think I did the.
Oh yes, so it would have been 2000 to 2001
Yes,
for Virtual Boy. Yeah. In any event,
6 releases during this period total for the Nintendo 64 in the United States.
right. So I have one pick that is not cheating, and then I've got 2 that are cheating.
Okay, I have one pick that is not cheating, and it is the only release, I think, for the Nintendo 64 in 2002.
Is it Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3?
It is.
My
yes.
pick is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2.
Which came out in
August of 2001.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it just barely fits the criteria.
Yeah.
And anyone who played these games played them on PlayStation, right?
Right. I mean, I had the first Tony Hawk's Pro Skater for the N64, and so that is the version, because I didn't know the PlayStation, that is the version I played the most. But Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, I just think it's amazing that, according to Wikipedia, it was the last N64 release in the United States,
Yeah.
period.
I believe it.
In 2002.
Yeah.
So crazy.
In its 6th year. Like, it is... This is part of like what this exercise is about, but like just consider that the Switch is still getting huge support in its 6th year. Kind of nothing that we've laid out so far is huge support, right? Like there are some like quirky fun titles, and then there's something like the Nintendo 64, which is just like not at all. And it was the Nintendo 64.
Yeah.
Like even digging through like the end of the 5th year, it's like Paper Mario and far and away like the best one on here, and like Conker's Bad Fur Day in March of 2001.
Wow.
But like otherwise there's really not much there. And part of that is just like the bad bet that Nintendo made with the Nintendo 64 of sticking with cartridges. And like, was that a bad bet? Like it made them very specific in a way that they didn't need to be at that time. But yeah, it just means they couldn't support it for 6 years.
Yeah, I mean, no even late Nintendo first party release, which
Right.
I feel like they usually do.
Yeah. But I mean, they're changing so much. Just change over to the GameCube. So much of just like that infrastructure, it changes.
Yeah.
And what they can fit on a disc versus what they could fit on a cartridge. Like it's all totally different.
Yep.
Next up is the Game Boy Color, which originally came out in October 1998. Which would theoretically make the 6th year October 2003 to October 2004. There are no games.
Yeah, literally nothing.
Literally nothing released in this period, and maybe not fair to single out the Game Boy Color as like a separate console release. I don't know. What do you think about that, Mark? it has a discrete library.
Yeah, Nintendo likes, like, nowadays when they're talking about the sales of the Game Boy,
Yeah, they lump them together.
They lump them together, but I always kind of think of them as separate systems.
Yeah, and the DS and the DSi, those are like the lumped together. We
Yeah,
lump.
so-
We don't
Yeah, so
separate
maybe
them in this
so
list.
even though I think of them as separate, maybe they are the same.
Maybe they are the same.
Yeah.
Next up, Game Boy Advance, originally released March 2001, making the 6th year, March 2006 to March 2007. Mark, I'm curious what you put for this one.
Okay, this is kind of like another Jurassic Park. Part 2, the story continues, or whatever.
Is this that Shrek game?
No, it's not the Shrek game. Of course, it's not Shrek. I would never do anything like that. It's Ghost Rider. They're released in February 2007, which was just a delightful reminder to me that there was a Nicolas Cage Ghost Rider movie.
2 of them.
Oh, that's right. They brought him back because they were like, the problem
There's
was
more
the
story here. Yes. Just like there were 2 Punisher movies. Like, I
That's
don't know.
right.
They couldn't take a single crack at these things.
Yeah.
Even that abysmal Daredevil movie had the Elektra sequel, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Or spin-off or whatever.
That's right. So I picked Ghost Rider from February 2007.
That game sounds good.
Published by Take-Two. But again, I feel like it is just a real snapshot of pop culture in 2007. Not that the Ghost Rider movie was like a overwhelming success or anything, but like where Marvel Studios was at the time,
Right.
and like that these types of movies were still getting made. And then also the Game Boy Advance by February 2007 is really reaching the point where Nintendo doesn't have a lot for it. Third parties don't have a lot for it. It's reaching that kind of like successful handheld spot where there's just so much licensed and,
Yes.
kind of like shovelware going on.
Which, I mean, and this is 3 years into the DS's life cycle. So, like, when they had introduced the Nintendo DS, they were like, this is the third pillar of like Nintendo
Really
hardware.
hedging their bets.
But didn't need to because it was a behemoth success. And like they tapered off on supporting the Game Boy Advance pretty quick.
And not too dissimilar to what happened with the Nintendo 3DS and the Switch,
Yeah.
where they clearly were planning for some Nintendo 3DS support later into the Nintendo 3DS's life. Then the Switch came out and sucked up all the oxygen, and anything released on the Nintendo 3DS might as well have just been dead.
Right.
And so
It's
so
still
they
got-
really just like curbed
Yeah.
support really quickly.
I mean, but they still like we say really quickly, but there was still stuff coming out into 2018. Like it just no one was buying it.
Yeah.
Like they were almost trying to like will the platform's life longer than it was ever going to last. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Ghost Rider's a great pick. I'd love to play that game. That sounds like a ton of fun. I am cheating here. I'm going with Final Fantasy VI Advance. Which is just Final Fantasy VI on the Game Boy Advance with like a few little tweaks and changes here and there. Final Fantasy VI is a borderline perfect game, and if you can play it, if you could play it at that time without having to deal with like PlayStation loading, that was the perfect way to play it.
I have never played the Game Boy Advance version of Final Fantasy VI.
Do you know? Neither have I.
Oh, I was just gonna, and that's totally okay. I was
Mm-hmm.
just gonna ask if you knew, like, if there were differences or anything like that, or if it was a pretty faithful port. But we don't have to dwell on it because
mean,
neither of us played it.
Right. I did like a little bit of research to try and figure out if there was anything different. And there are a few more espers. There are a few more spells. Some glitches are fixed. There's like an extra dragon to battle. So it seems like it's pretty faithful, which is good. Like the game doesn't need too many changes. But just to be able to have it on the go.
I mean, I love that pick because one of the things that was really special for me about the Game Boy Advance is it didn't have a virtual console, obviously,
Right.
but it was the first time that they were like re-releasing
A bunch of NES games.
a bunch of NES games. They were porting some Super Nintendo games, like
Mhm.
Link to the Past, like all that kind of stuff, and you could play it handheld and on the go for the first time, and
Well,
that was really cool.
And like the cornerstone of the library was the Super Mario Advance series. They made 4 of them, and they're just ports of previous Super Mario Brothers games.
Yeah. But you just didn't have the opportunity to like play those in handheld
Yeah.
before. Like that was a big deal. So being able to play something like Final Fantasy VI on the go, that is awesome.
Yeah, well, and also just to be able to play, like especially in 2007 when it came out, February 2007, that is long enough away from the original release of the game that it wasn't likely that you would be able to find a cart that you weren't going to have to spend like $100 on. And then, I guess there were always the I forget if it's called Final Fantasy Anthology or Final Fantasy. There were two of them on PlayStation, two collections. One of them that had like 4 and 6, and another that had like 5 and Chrono Trigger. I may have those pairings wrong, but they would have been great versions of the games if they didn't have to load into every fight scene, which just killed the momentum and for me made them unplayable. But yeah, this is a perfect way to do that on the GBA. Next up is the GameCube. Originally released September 2001, which means that the 6th year is September 2006 to September 2007. Mark, what's your poll here?
Okay, I picked Baten Kaitos Origins, which released in September 2006, the sequel to the original Baten Kaitos game by Monolith Soft, which is now creating the Xenoblade Chronicle games and helping out Nintendo on a bunch of different games. Like they worked on Breath of the Wild, for example. The reason I chose this one is at this point, this was towards the end of Nintendo Power, but this was when I was subscribed to Nintendo Power. I didn't have it.
Mark, we were like ships in the night.
Yes, totally. I did not have it earlier at all. But I was subscribed at this point, and there were not. Yes, Twilight Princess was releasing 2006, but the Wii was right on the horizon. Nobody was sure. Yes, like they were hyping up the Wii and everything like that, but nobody knew the Wii was going to become the phenomenon that it was. It was still this kind of like weird system that was trying to do something completely different.
Right.
It had the reputation of 2 GameCubes duct taped together. It was just like, it was another one of those weird Nintendo transitory periods where they were not focusing on the GameCube anymore. So other than Twilight Princess, which was this cross-generational game that would be available on GameCube, but was a really important launch title for Wii as well.
Yep.
Nintendo was publishing just like these curiosities like Baten Kaitos Origins, and they were hyping the heck out of it because that's like all
they had.
That's all they had.
I just went with Twilight Princess on this because I'm a coward, but also because it demonstrates that like the 6th year of the GameCube's release was a Wii game. Like Nintendo was transforming itself from a classic console manufacturer to something new. And so even anything that they were putting out on their old stuff was part of the something new. And so that's why I went with Twilight Princess. But you're like, think about them just being like, yeah, I don't know, put this out there. And it's not even the first Baten Kaitos game. It's a sequel to it. Is very funny to me.
Up next is the Nintendo DS, originally released November 2004, meaning the 6th year that we're counting is November 2009 to November 2010.
This one was a challenge for me.
This one was a challenge for me too. So the one thing that's interesting is that the list of DS games on the Wikipedia page has to be broken up into 4 tables.
Yeah.
There are so many games released for the Nintendo DS.
Right. But they start to dwindle out in the 6th year, that like there are fewer and fewer releases, and certainly further fewer and fewer releases of note or of any kind of consequence, which is what made it tough for me. I wanted to, my instinct was like Bowser's Inside Story or GTA Chinatown Wars, but they were both early enough in 2009 that they fall outside of the exercise. So I'm curious where you landed, Mark.
I had a hard time picking a game for this. Looking back on this, because I remember having a lot to play on my DS all the time, and maybe because there were so many games and there were heavy hitters through a lot of its life, but looking through this specific time period, it reminded me of the Wii, where it like started really strong, but by the end was kind of like Nintendo wasn't publishing a ton for it. Third parties had kind of like moved off of it, and so you were getting like a weird mix of stuff. Yeah, which I guess is the story for a lot of 6 years.
It's true, and like this is also where the inputs of the original DS, like where you run up against the limit of there's no analog stick on it, not even the analog slider that we eventually see on the 3DS. And when they would try to like fake it using the touch screen, either in the Mario 64 DS or like Metroid Prime Hunters, that like it's just this like ungainly mess that like doesn't feel good, and largely doesn't work. So I think the need, like the biggest need that the 3DS filled, was like, here's some analog directional control.
So here are the like two games in
Give
this
me
time
two
period
games,
that I
Mark. Give me
picked.
two games.
One is Band Hero that released in November 2009.
Wow.
So, by this point, Rock Band was out.
Yeah.
Guitar Hero had been an enormous success,
Mhm.
but was trying to figure out how it like moved into the Rock Band, like doing more than just guitars. And the way that they do it on the DS is actually really funny. So in the bottom Game Boy Advance slot, you slotted in this accessory that had like 4 buttons on it.
Mhm.
So kind of similar to what was on a Guitar Hero guitar. And then
Just
you
-1. Yeah.
and you can use like a pick to strum the touchscreen, but then it had these like 4 buttons coming out of the bottom. That,
Well, it was a pick that was a stylus. Like it came with the game.
Yes.
I definitely had Guitar Hero on tour. I'm interested to hear about Band Tour or Band Hero.
Yeah, so Band Hero, then it also had drums, and this was like another accessory that was like
That plugged into
it didn't plug in. It was an overlay, like almost think of it as like a faceplate for the bottom half of your Nintendo DS.
Sure, yeah.
And so
so it pushed down on little discrete places on the touchscreen.
No, not on the touchscreen, on the buttons on the side.
What?
Yeah, so it was like 4 round circles that kind of looked like, the drums
drum
that you would
heads,
see.
yeah.
But then they must have been like hitting the face buttons on the controller. And then the third piece was vocals, and I don't think there was an accessory for vocals, just
No,
like the
there was the
microphone
microphone built
within
in,
like
yeah.
the Nintendo DS. And so the reason I chose Band Hero is because I think it's a good kind of mix of the kind of third-party stuff that was releasing on the DS at this point in its life, plus such a snapshot of the Guitar Hero / Rock Band kind of like mania that was really beginning to peak at this point.
Yep.
There were so many plastic accessories. There were so many versions of like Rock Band and Guitar Hero being released. So I chose Band Hero. The second one I chose was just because it was like, oh yeah, I remember that was like a thing. Do you remember? And there's no reason anybody should. Do you remember Zuzu Pets?
Sure.
The little like robotic hamster like toys that I had younger siblings who were super into them, and yeah, it was just like one of those like toy phenomenons for a couple of years. And so Zuzu Pets the game was released in March 2010 on the Nintendo DS.
Wow.
But like they released 4 of them within a like 18-month span.
Man, that's a weird pull, Mark. Do you have any idea what the gameplay was like in that?
I don't. I'm assuming it was kind of like Nintendogs, but for Zuzu Pets, but I don't know if that's true. The other thing that released in this period of note that is a Nintendo first-party release is Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that came
Wow.
out in December 2009.
Is that within our?
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah. So Pokemon Black and White came out in 2010 as well. So like there's a Pokemon game here, which is like the right answer, but we don't really really care or connect with that. Like I said, I had a hard time coming up with one, but if you say Spirit Tracks, I may just claim Spirit Tracks.
Yeah, that came out in December 2009.
That's great, but I also just want to mention this this visual novel from Chunsoft called 9. So it stylizes 999, 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors, and it's the beginning of the Zero Escape series. And I was just reading up on how trippy and weird it is. A cool visual novel that I would like to play.
It's supposed to be amazing. I think they're available on Steam. There was somebody in our there was somebody in our Discord who was playing through all of them or one in the series or something like that. but I remember like reading about this 999 game
Yeah.
and hearing about it on like the 1UP show and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I don't have any information about it, but it's now like it has piqued my interest, and now I want to get into it. What lessons do we draw? What overall trends do we see in the sixth year of the DS?
I don't think it's that dissimilar from a lot of the other 60 years that we've looked at, where it's like Nintendo's attention has started to wander.
Right.
Third parties have made their money on the system or figured out what didn't work. Like you said, like Chinatown Wars notoriously sold really poorly compared to
Right.
Rockstar's, expectations.
But then they put it out on PSP and it was fine.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's this period where Nintendo occasionally will still release like a couple, like a game like Spirit Tracks, but for the most part, it's kind of left to the devices of licensed, titles and third-party curiosities.
Mark, let's move on to the Wii. We're like finally entering the modern era, which I know is 16 years ago at this point. So how modern is it really? So the Wii came out in 2006, November 2006, which means the sixth year is November 2011 through November 2012. Mark, this is another place where I took the coward's way out, and I just picked The Legend of Zelda: The Skyward Sword because it was the example of the one game that Nintendo put out during this. I'm sure they put out others, but like this was the only like high profile release. It's something that they had been teasing forever. It had been shown at multiple E3s and was just like my God, just give us the next Zelda. And then it was like a little bit impenetrable at the time, like didn't have a great reputation, sort of until its re-release on the Switch.
Yeah, it reviewed really well.
Great. 10 out of 10 on IGN.
Yeah, it reviewed really well, but then went through this period of, especially I think at that point people were
done with motion controls.
Done with motion controls.
By the sixth year.
Done with like the Zelda like strict formula.
Yeah.
And yeah, so a weird time for for Skyward Sword to be released. But you say that when you're talking about Skyward Sword and how it was like released at the very end and was kind of like Nintendo's last hurrah and a little bit of like, come on already. I mean, super similar to the story with the GameCube that we were talking about earlier, where, yes, Nintendo was publishing other stuff, but it was almost out of like desperation to fill their library. Yet they still had this major release on the horizon, but otherwise their attention had turned elsewhere to the Wii, And here with the Wii, they were really turning their attention to the 3DS and the incredibly difficult for all studios, but Nintendo was just doing it a generation later than everybody else. Incredibly difficult change to HD. So the Wii, notoriously, its last few years, had very few releases of substance. And it's funny that you picked Skyward Sword because I picked another like RPG that Nintendo was publishing in the US out of desperation, and that's The Last Story.
We should also just that's great. I didn't know if you were gonna go Last Story or Xenoblade Chronicles, but let's hear about The Last Story.
I mean, both
are huge like points of desperation and things that fans were asking for. Like this is part of the Project Rainfall, right?
Yeah,
that these games were out in Europe, and they were like, "Why don't you bring
Japan,
these over?"
Right, and it was like, just like there's nothing releasing on the Wii. Like, bring these over. We want these games. Pandora's Tower was like another game.
The reason I mentioned Europe is that it means that they were already localized in English.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, The Last Story is a game by Mistwalker Corporation, which is the company that Hironobu Sakaguchi, kind of like the father of Final Fantasy, created after he left Square Enix. And I have never played it. It's one that I don't think has ever had a re-release, but would be amazing if it did because it's supposed to be really, really good. An amazing RPG that just came out in the United States at the worst possible time.
Right.
When nobody was paying attention to the Wii.
Yes, worst possible time on the worst possible hardware for it. Which is all just, I mean, that is the story of the latter days of the Wii, right? That just like, it wasn't, no one was playing games there anymore. And if they were still just playing Wii Sports.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, like the writing should have been on the wall for the Wii U, just how quickly those like the casual players that gave the Wii so much life were dropping it, because at that point iPhone games were,
Right.
out. Like the iPhone 4 had just been released or was about to be released, which again was such a huge generational leap. The App Store had games on it. The
Right.
iPad existed. Like all of these things that the Wii U was kind of trying to tap into that part of the zeitgeist.
And the DS.
Yeah.
That like it was just like people were getting their fix elsewhere and at places that they just already had the new hardware because they needed a phone or whatever. I have a curious little note here that I don't think like adds into the narrative at all, but a game from December of 2011 called Fortune Street, which is a like a Monopoly like developed by Square Enix, featuring Mario characters and Dragon Quest characters. That's all.
I think it's a big series in Japan.
Yeah.
That only occasionally gets localized here. But yeah, like Monopoly, I've heard it described as like Mario Party-esque, but I've never played it myself.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like there are mini games in it. I watched some gameplay to try and like wrap my head around it, and it's just like it looks like you're just moving around a board, buying like stores and stuff, and then other people land in the stores and they have to pay for shopping at your store.
Oh wow.
But yeah, that's just another little game that I pulled out there. Mark, let's move on to the 3DS. Originally released March 2011, which makes its 6th year, March 2016 to March 2017.
At this point, I picked Mario Party Star Rush, which was released in November 2016. This
is a good pick.
So the reason I picked this one is because it is I don't know, I guess I just feel like it's emblematic of the kind of support that Nintendo was giving the 3DS at this point in its life. You were getting a lot of like WarioWare Gold-esque things, which I actually, now that I say that, I don't know.
Came later, right?
Yeah, I don't know that this was a like best of compilation.
No,
for
but
Mario Party.
There was one of those, and also it came out later. I mean, the part of the reason I had a tough time with this one is that the 3DS had such a rad long life that there are still bangers coming out in its 6th year. This is another example of I wanted to pick. There was a game that I was like, that's got to be in the 6th year. Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia. Nope, 7th year.
Oh, wow.
Came out in its 7th year. And then Fire Emblem Fates came out the very end of the 5th year. So like getting strong Fire Emblem support just on either side of the 6th year. But my pull, obviously, Mark, has to be from May 2016, Pocket Card Jockey.
Oh, yeah. Wow, did it really come out that late?
Yes.
Wow.
Also worth noting that Kirby Planet Robobot and Box Boy both came out in June 2016, and Pokemon Sun and Moon were November 2016. So like the 3DS, even though that's approaching the release of the Switch and what would eventually like kill it, going strong in its 6th year.
Yeah, man, Sun and Moon.
Yeah,
that was a phenomenon. Like it was really riding the wave of Pokemon Go at that point.
Yeah, totally. That absolutely has to do with that. Saying that Sun and Moon came out in November 2016, that means that Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are like another year away.
Yeah.
And the remakes of the Mario and Luigi games come out in 2017, 2018. Metroid Samus Returns comes out in late 2017. So like, even though by like the very end it is drips and drabs, its end comes later than most other Nintendo consoles that we see.
Yeah, that's true. That's a really good point.
Now, Mark, do we bother subjecting the Wii U to this exercise?
I have one thing I do want to point out
Okay.
for the Wii U. So originally released November 2012. So it's 6th year, November 2017 to November 2018. Even by November 2017, the Wii U was just an afterthought. Like the Switch was everything.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, basically starting in March 2017 with the release of Breath of the Wild, which again, one of the greatest games of all time.
Also available on the Wii U.
Also available on the Wii U.
But my pick...
But that's it. That's the end.
Yeah. My pick is Just Dance 2019.
This is good.
Which is the...
also came out on Wii.
Yes. All that is the reason why I had to bring it up, is because it also came out on Wii, but Just Dance 2019, which was released in 2018, is the last Just Dance game, the last Ubisoft game to be published. I think maybe the last game to be published on the Wii U. But in 2020, Just Dance 2021 or whatever. Anyways, the next, oh no, sorry. In next year's release in 2019, Just Dance 2020 would still be published on Wii.
But not Wii U.
Not Wii U. So
Yeah.
the Wii even outlasted.
Stunning.
Yeah,
That is stunning.
the Wii U.
Yeah, so congratulations to Just Dance turning the Wii U into a Just Dance machine, or the Wii into a Just Dance machine.
Yep.
Absolutely incredible stuff. I didn't submit anything for this because there's basically nothing. Which then just brings us to the Switch and the modern era, and the year that we are currently in. Switch originally came out March 2017, which makes the 6th year March 2022 to March 2023. I didn't pick anything for this, but and I don't know that we can really see the shape of the trends right now because we're in it. But it feels like kind of a regular Switch year to me.
Yeah. 2017 was such a weird year for the Switch in
Yeah.
hindsight because it had so many amazing, like,
Yeah.
big games, and they were coming so early in the generation. They were like, oh my gosh, we're going to have all this time for, like, another Zelda, another Mario, another
Right.
Mario Kart, another Smash, like all of these things. And it hasn't
happened,
turned
yeah.
out that way. Like,
Right.
no year has repeated 2017, which makes sense. Like, how could it possibly?
Right. But 2018 and 2019 were impressive, like, medium runs. And then kind of since then, 2020, 2021, and 2022 have been sort of like the next step down, sort of.
Sort of.
But, like, you got to count, like, 2020, say what you will about the year in general, Animal Crossing came out. You know,
Right.
like,
Yeah, I guess I feel like since we're in it, it's kind of hard to see.
yes.
But I feel like what's impressive about the Switch in 2022 is that you can see Nintendo's strategy of consolidating the development to a single system instead of
Yes.
having to support like a handheld and a home console. Everything is just on this hybrid system, really paying dividends because it's the 6th year of the console and you're still getting like major releases in a way that going through this list, very few consoles
Yeah.
were getting, and not only major releases, but consistent release schedule.
Right,
It's
right.
not like these other consoles or a lot of these other consoles where it's like, they had like one big game left in them. It's like, no, like, yes, does it feel like we're leading up to Breath of the Wild 2 as some sort of like grand,
Yeah, some
finale?
grand capstone.
But you're still
Like, maybe, but, like, we got to assume Metroid Prime 4 is still after that.
right. Yeah, you have Metroid Prime
And still
4.
Switch.
Even this year you're getting Splatoon 3,
Bayonetta 3.
Right. So like it feels different for Nintendo to have
Totally.
like the kind of schedule that it has even in the Switch's 6th year.
What you said about them, like, no longer developing for the 2 separate platforms, or for that brief period 3 separate platforms, although obviously they stopped supporting the GBA. The one thing that I wish they were able to do is like just release games that are like of the visual fidelity of like GBA or 3DS, and just be happy with that. I understand that like the requirements for like a Nintendo game, like that they just need to be higher quality. And like you could still have a high quality game that just looks like it's a Super NES game or like a GBA game. And I wish they could just do that.
That was my hope as well. Like, especially in the beginning of the Switch's life, it was like, they're going to have their Breath of the Wilds, they're going to have their Super Mario Odysseys, but what about just these smaller like
Right.
projects, like a kind of like a simple over the top Zelda, like that sort of thing. But it does feel like we are not going to get those because Metroid Dread was probably the closest.
And maybe the
To
Link's Awakening remake.
Right, but Link's Awakening feels like such a curiosity, like
Yeah.
in that I don't think they would use that same engine to just develop another, like
Although if
Zelda
they did,
from that
I would
perspective.
love it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess never say never, but yeah, it does feel like I wish that as well.
Yeah.
I wish that they were taking more of those like risks almost.
Yeah, totally.
But
Well, like you just think about, I said before, in the first 5 years of the 3DS, Fire Emblem Awakening and Fates came out. In the first 6 years of the Switch, just 3 houses.
Yeah. I feel like I feel like it's kind of like two pieces. One, Nintendo, for as big of a presence as it has, is not an enormous company.
Right.
And you can see that in that they lean on so many third parties, second parties to help them develop these games. And, Intelligent Systems, I guess maybe not developed, but definitely had a hand in Three Houses. In Origami King, they developed, presumably whatever this next Fire Emblem is,
Right.
they'll be involved with. But
Also, were they working on the remake of Advance Wars?
no, I think that was I
don't
I
know.
thought that was entirely the U.S. studio whose name Way Forward. I think that was entirely Way
yes,
Forward.
that's right.
But I don't know what kind of consulting they were doing since they were.
I wish that game would come out.
Yeah, someday maybe. But anyways, just to say, I totally agree with you. But I wonder if it's just opportunity cost, and
Yeah.
Nintendo HD development is just so
It's so standard now.
it's so resource intensive as
Yeah,
well
yeah.
that I don't know that they really have the bandwidth for these kind of like smaller projects.
Yeah. Yep. Which is a little bit of a shame, just because like we know how well all software sells on Switch, and especially all software that like is published by Nintendo. Like everything does well.
I also think I was trying to think like, oh, it'd be awesome if Capcom were to make another, like Zelda, like they did Minish Cap
Sure.
during the GBA period. But I don't think Capcom is equipped to do that anymore. They are
Yeah.
so like an HD
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
like development studio that I don't think they have the tools.
Yeah.
I think that's another problem.
Well, and I guess that's probably why Inti Creates is just quietly pumping out Azure Gunvolt games. There've been like 10 of them since the Switch came out.
Yeah.
And they come out to all platforms, but I'm sure that's where they sell is on Switch. So like I guess someone is filling those gaps. It's just not Nintendo.
Yeah,
and
it's more
not,
on like the indie side.
Yeah.
It's like Nintendo has to
that's
work
sort
with
of like
Dot
middle
Emu
space
or like something
too.
like that. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, you're right. Not even like indie, but it's just like smaller, like Way Forward or Inti Creates, where
Yeah.
they specialize in like that sort of game development.
Right. Totally. All right, Mark. This is good. Let's close this out. I would love to know if other people have experience with games that came out in the 6th year of a console's lifespan. And I think, Mark, do you think this is a different proposition for non-Nintendo consoles?
I don't really have any sense of that, but it'd be interesting to look.
I mean, and just thinking about like the PlayStation 4, it's hard for me to actually, without having like the dates in front of me, to conceptualize what's the 6th year and what's the 7th year.
They also had such different third party support, you know, where
right.
like, yeah.
Well, just thinking about like first party support, like in my mind, I put like Last of Us 2, Ghost of Tsushima in the PlayStation 4's 6th year. Maybe it's the 7th technically. I'm not sure. But that like the really late in the system, because the generational line is so like blurred, and you can just play that great game on the new hardware and it just looks and sounds better and feels better. That like, yeah, I almost feel like the distinction is becoming irrelevant between generations. Anyway, if you have any thoughts on this, dear listener, please let us know. Hop in the Discord, join us there, email us at nintendocartridgesociety@gmail.com.
Oops.
Oh man. Mark, you're gonna be taking a couple weeks here.
That's right.
So obviously our listeners will hear from you as we rank all the tracks in Mario Kart coming up. But otherwise, we will see you in a couple weeks. That's gonna do it for this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society. Remember, please rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the episode, you should share it on Facebook or Twitter or any old place where you share stuff. We appreciate it when you do that. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm at Patrick_Ellers. Mark is at MKE Mitchell. And the show is at Nincart Society. We also have a Facebook page, which is just Nintendo Cartridge Society. Anthony DeLuca made our logo. Our theme music is provided by 8-Bit Betty. You can get more of his music by going to 8bitbetty.com or by listening right now. For my co-host, Mark Mitchell, this is Patrick Ellers saying thank you for listening.